Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to those who are joining online. It's really nice to have you all here. It's Tuesday afternoon in the UK at 2 p.m. and we are welcoming you to this CTHE webinar. Just to let me know if anyone can't hear online, but I'm hoping that Mia can nod and smile because Mia is joining us online as one of the presenters. Mia Delavidi from the University of Bath. Holly Rook is in the room with us here in Oxford. Sheffield and Corinne Squire is next to me as well at the University of Bristol. And they're going to be talking today about their research into refugee access and UK higher education, which is a really important topic, given all the debates around this today, which is World Access to Higher Education Day. So it's a very suitable day to be having this event. And right now in South Africa, there's a whole conference on Wahed. But thank you for joining us here. And I'm going to hand over to Corinne and Holly and Mia. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David, and lovely to see all of you here. And hopefully we'll chat with you all later. I'm Corinne from the University of Bristol and have been involved with initiatives to try to support people from refugee backgrounds going to higher education for quite a long time, in particular with a program called the Open Learning Initiative, or OLIVE. I'm going to ask Holly just to say hello, and Mia also.
Yeah, hi everyone, Holly. Yeah, great to have you all here and looking forward to sharing the findings of our research and then discussing it with you afterwards. And Mia.
Hi everyone, my name is Mir. I'm originally from Afghanistan and I'm here based at University of Bath. Thank you.
Thanks, Mir. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the context for this work, which is this initiative by UNHCR to encourage us to reach the target of 50% of refugees accessing higher education by 2030. Currently, it's around 9%, and that's 2/3 men. UNHCR has an initiative called Each One Take One, which is developed recently, so you have a big chance if you're interested to get involved with this. I think they're very keen to have more people involved, particularly from low middle income countries, universities. So this is an initiative that's designed really to encourage universities to work to their own strengths in doing these kinds of projects that will bring refugees into higher education. So, in fact, in the UK, this is a kind of small issue. The UK has about 1% of refugees worldwide, and of course has high resources, generally speaking, in the university sector. But the UK, like many other countries, has quite a small number of refugees going into higher education. From what we can see, probably less than 15%. And it also has a kind of difficult environment for that to really increase very much at the moment. There's quite little data generally around refugees' access to higher education. It's rather incomplete, and the research is also rather sparse, especially outside of high-income countries and refugee camps. It's there. So universities are pretty keen on celebrating their sanctuary scholars and so on, but there are many refugees who never get near to university through a scholarship route or otherwise. And that's particularly true, I guess, in the UK, but true in other country contexts as well. We think that, a lot of higher education access difficulties for refugees are quite similar in different countries. Problems like the difficulties that citizenship status presents, fee and other resource costs, the difficulties of qualifications transfer, getting the appropriate language skills, and then the whole kind of nexus of economic, social and personal difficulties with which a lot of refugees live. All those issues you can find in a lot of different country contexts, really. And of course, the difficulties are also in the UK case, especially historical. People in the UK as refugees are often people coming from countries that the UK colonised. So as refugees will often say to you, we're here because you're there. And that dynamic, is kind of intensified by the kind of continuing colonial epistemic violence that you see exerted by, UK higher education. we got interested also in that the existing research doesn't always include all the relevant sectors. Most of it actually is with refugees themselves, finding out what they see as barriers or difficulties in accessing HE. But some of the research is with people who are within HE, but very little of it actually works with people who are in education at kind of earlier levels, people working in high schools or in colleges with refugees. Very little is with NGOs that support refugees, and that's possibly their major place of support. And quite little really with local government and even with national government around what they might be doing more in these areas. So in our research, we wanted to work cross-sectorally in that way. And we were also aware that we were going to be working in 22 to 24 in the context of post-COVID, which have raised other kinds of educational difficulties for people, obviously, in the context of an increasingly hostile environment in a lot of high-income countries to migrants and refugees, and also in the context of a cost of living crisis, which a lot of our participants mentioned actually when talking about access to higher education. So we did semi-structured interviews with about 38 people across those kind of sectors that I've mentioned. And we asked them these questions about the benefits of higher education for refugees, what the barriers and supports are for getting into higher education. We also asked about progression within higher education, because access is not just the end of it, right? Once, as Mia often says, once you're through the door, then what happens? And even opening the door is quite a complex process. And then we also asked people what they thought would be ways of improving access to higher education, what would be the kind of affordances that would make that more possible. And we did a kind of straightforward thematic analysis really of that material. So what we found was in some ways quite similar to what other researchers found in terms of what people see as the benefits of higher education for refugees. What people said was that the benefits are in terms of career and economic level for refugees. People learn skills that are valuable. They develop from our higher education very important networks for themselves. Refugees become more confident and proud of themselves for their achievements, more a part of UK communities. People also pointed out quite often, which is also being seen in other research, the benefits that universities came, in terms of diversity, knowledge and skills actually also that come into the university. So they gain epistemic themselves a lot. But there's some perhaps new interesting things that people said, or things that perhaps haven't been registered so much in this research. One was that in terms of a UK degree being a kind of currency globally, what a lot of people were interested in was that its currency in the global south, so that they would be able to go different places outside of the high income countries with their university degree. They also talked a lot about English, and this would maybe apply with other languages, but English is becoming kind of deeply familiar to them through university education in a way that they felt wouldn't have happened through using English in employment or something like this. They felt kind of that it was part of them, and that they valued that. So those were kind of and they also talked quite a lot about the kind of giving back, the kind of circularity of the gains here that having gained from higher education, that would then feed back into refugee communities, and they would each one would operate within refugee communities who would actually be supporting others towards higher education. So the barriers that people talked about, again, lots of them have been found in other research, so we're not claiming anything super novel here, but one was just the general precarity of having refugee status, and presciently in the UK, people with refugee status also felt that they had a precarious status, which it turns out they do. And if reform gets in, that precarity will be realised. So, refugees perhaps know best about this kind of precarity and how states can continue it long term. They talked a lot, and this is a common theme in the literature, about the difficult to meet English requirements, a kind of ludicrous gold standard of IELTS, and the difficulties of paying for the test, and also for the training. It's very hard to get training for that. Other countries have done better. Germany has done a lot of work around German teaching for for students who want to go into a higher education. Finland too has done that kind of work. That hasn't really happened so much around English, which is kind of blithely assumed to be, universally available. Qualification transfer also, which we were talking about a little bit with David earlier today, is a kind of very difficult issue, and again, super determined by what high income countries think is a good qualification and a good university, and even a good country to come from in terms of higher education. And these are rules are quite standardly expressed. And the admissions officer told me, for instance, not in the study, that they never looked at Afghan qualifications because they were not verifiable. Other difficulties were just the unfamiliarity, as you might imagine, of going to any other country and having to deal with a different education system. For a lot of people, also the need to become familiar with digital learning and get digital resources. And you can see that within a lot of, particularly in, I would say, maybe lower middle income countries generally, where people in earlier stages of education are not so digitally immersed, and then when they get to university, for instance, in Ghana, that's quite an issue. I think schooling is not necessarily digital, and in university it's highly digital. So that was something they pointed out. And then just generally economic constraints, the lack of scholarships, grants, possibilities of support with transport, childcare, all kinds of other issues that refugees face, mostly belonging in the UK to, mostly sitting in the UK in lower income strata within the UK. So I'm going to finish that.
Thank you. So kind of a more positive strand of our findings was around what factors improve access to education either already do or could further. And most of these that participants talked about, really importantly, are rooted in really kind of holistic approaches, refugee-centred and broadly very socially just approaches. And so some of the factors that people identified that improve access or could further include extended teaching support and information. And the really crucial point of that is that it needs to be proactive and adaptable to refugees' requirements. So, for example, providing multilingual information guides as one kind of small example. Support from friends and family was identified as a huge enhancing factor, and that can be financial, practical, emotional. I think a vast number of our participants from refugee backgrounds spoke a lot about how important their support networks had been in terms of their access. Another point is just refugees' own high engagement and their real desire and drive to make use of the educational opportunities that are available, a really strong work ethic, and it comes up a lot as well. Something else that could be done more, which Corinne kind of mentioned, is a fairer, more flexible approach to English requirements and to non-UK qualifications. A greater availability of foundation and access courses is really another really key factor. Those people who had accessed foundation courses spoke about them as, I think one participant spoke of it as being the backbone for his university experience, providing that foundation of knowledge, which then allows people to do really well and they progress. Support from NGOs is hugely important, and that can be mentorship schemes, personalised advice, community connections. And a lot of people talk about how support from NGOs is often very long-term in a way that other types of support might not be. And then, of course, academic support initiatives. So this might look like assistance with applications or qualification transfer, just simple things like explaining the UK system of personal statements, because I think it's quite weird for anyone, but people who have no familiarity with it even more so. So linked to these, we identified many institutional factors that either support or constrain refugees' HE access. And as Corinne mentioned, many of these support previous research with refugees, but also with other low HE access groups. So for instance, care leavers or other groups. However, there were some distinct aspects as well. So the institutional difficulties fell into 4 key categories. The first is incoherence, and this is both within universities themselves and also between universities and other sectors, so further education, NGOs, for instance. And this means that communication and information that people receive is often unclear, unnecessary, complicated, and really inconsistent. So many of the participants we spoke to from a refugee background who had experience trying to access university, it described the process as a kind of feeling like it was a maze or a puzzle. It was impenetrable, and at every corner there was a new challenge, and yeah, that it was a kind of never-ending, disorientating process. A second key difficulty is the lack of understanding of refugee situations and therefore refugee-specific institutional practice. And this can look like, for instance, the assumption that everyone will be able to provide a hard copy of their undergraduate certificate, which, if you've been in a situation in which you've had to flee, is not going to be possible. Or another thing that comes up again and again is funding and fees and refugees incorrectly being classed as international students simply because they have an international passport. And this is something that is prevalent across universities and causes people huge issues. Resource shortages, of course, is something that people come up against again and again. And this is in NGOs and further education as well as higher education. For instance, some of the people in NGOs we spoke to talked about really wanting to help people with their educational journeys, but simply having to spend the kind of day-to-day firefighting and providing for people's basic needs, which doesn't leave the space to do that. And within universities, the lack of sanctuary scholarships was something that came up again and again. One participant described the current sanctuary scholarships as a drop in the ocean. And then exclusion and institutional racism, for instance, particular countries' qualifications being disregarded immediately. And then obviously, on the other hand of that, thinking about how these things can be addressed, improve communication and coherence within universities, and a way of guiding people through the whole application process from beginning to end. More refugee-centred strategies was identified as really important, and that could be things like having other people from refugee backgrounds at open days to talk about their experiences. Increased resources, of course, greater outreach in communities, and dedicated wellbeing support. And then generally a kind of more radical openness of HE, which could be greater flexibility around English competence or previous qualifications. And of course, as Cara mentioned, it's not just about getting to universities. It's really important about how people progress and are supported to progress once they're there. And so within our research, there were lots of both kind of university and non-university factors that were identified as being hugely important to support progress. Some of these within universities looks like dedicated staff tutors, again, that consistency and having someone to accompany you through that journey. Strong community amongst other refugee background or international students, support to learn the different ways that assessment is done or the different teaching styles. And then, of course, non-university factors is support from family, community and employers. A couple of people who were studying part-time and working identified a flexible and supportive employer as key to their success. So just very briefly, from those findings, and many recommendations came out, but kind of looking quite generally, because Mir's going to look at some of the more sector-specific ones, but very things that apply kind of across sectors and across groups and across institutions. just a clear one is adopting a more refugee-centred approach, you know, ensuring that from the beginning, in the creation, implementation, evaluation, every stage, refugees themselves are involved in thinking about how access can be improved. Recognising their own resources, the support networks that we talked about, previous experience, I think is a really important one. Things like, I remember speaking to someone who had been a construction manager and had managed kind of multi-million-pound projects in his country of origin, but then was struggling to access a master's in construction here just because he didn't have a maths A level or something, and looking at ways that those previous experiences in work can be utilised, for instance. Greater collaboration across sectors is another huge one, which would ensure continuity for the people trying to access higher education, but also would be a great way of sharing best practice and learning, because lots of people are doing really good things, but it's not necessarily being shared hugely. And of course, wherever possible, addressing the hostile environments that refugees and all migrants are facing in the UK at the moment. And just kind of a few practical ways that might materialise, you know, making all the different pathways into university really accessible and clear, and having that information in one place and in a coherent way. Things like offering alternative English language tests. There's lots of options through Duolingo and lots of different ones that are popping up, but a lot of the time universities won't accept them. Providing more scholarships and fee waivers would be great, where possible, of course. And then, yeah, continuing that kind of partnership working that I've been talking about. So I think that's over to you, Mir. I'll do the slides for you. I think I know, but just give me a nudge if I won't go next.
Thank you so much, both. I just start with by putting something in the chat. There's a book some of you might have read, 100,000 Welcomes by Tiffy Allen, which talks about the story of City of Sanctuary from 2005 and 2019. So toward the end of the book, they talk about sanctuary as a verb, not as a noun. And speaking of approaching this wicked problem, very complex problem that 91% of people from refugee background don't have access to higher education. It's not only higher education at university level, even, but UNHCR says is beyond year 12 or year 11 in some context. But toward the end of the book, what Tiffany argues is sanctuary should be understood as an action, not just as a place. And in other words, everyone can do something practical to protect and support others. That's why in our report, in our findings, we talk about those practical recommendations as well that Holly already talked about some of the works that we can do across the sectors. So in terms of universities, within higher education itself, universities and colleges can take concrete and practical steps. And the first thing they can do is to build that refugee inclusive admission systems, including having specific staff, designated staff or key contacts who understand the complexities of refugee status and can guide applicants through the process. We hope we can see one day that at each university we have that designated person who has the relevant information. And the second could be creating welcoming environments, and that means providing holistic support, not just academically, but socially, practically, things related to childcare, transport, mental health services, and so on. Because as both Corinne and Holly mentioned, it's not only about opening the doors, it's about progress as well. It's about thriving. It's about what happens next and how they come back and contribute to the community in terms of integration and so on. And also it's strengthening this.
I'm just wondering, you want to.
Sorry, they were.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I'm
That's okay. I thought someone had a question. Okay. So next could be a strengthening progression support. So talking about it's not only access, it's once they are enrolled, what could be done to offer more support. And we see that refugees who make it into higher education still face major challenges. And once they are there, so initiatives like mentorship programs, alumni network, career counseling, and they could make big differences. And of course, transparency is key. Publishing data on refugee admissions, outcomes, those would help institutions learn from one another and build accountability. So it's not only within the UK. We see a lot of success at the University of Sanctuaries level when they share best practices, but this could be done with other universities as well. So, in terms of roles of NGOs and local authorities and refugees, the way they can play roles, it's beyond higher education institutions. NGOs, local authorities, they definitely can contribute. NGOs can collaborate closely um, because they're on the ground. They can collaborate with universities, colleges to provide these preparatory courses. They can do advocacy. They can offer practical support with applications, fundings, and so on, which we have seen a lot of heavy lifting by these people on the ground or supporting people from refugee background. Local authorities can make a difference as well by training their staff on refugee education pathways. From my experience, I see in most cases their staff might have knowledge of education at primary, secondary level, but they're not trained enough how to support um, further levels when it comes to higher education access and so on. And of course, in terms of refugee communities themselves, we have a very strong assets there. So they can be and they are active contributors. We could have more peer networks, community groups, refugee-led advocacy that could kind of amplify these awareness and use these available resources to have more inclusive policy. So talking about the policy changes, it's difficult to change policies, but there are ways that practically we can start doing that. Because none of these actions can succeed without supportive national policy. We have stories that people succeeded, they could get a scholarship, they could get admission, but let's say the next person could not receive the same support because there was only one person at the university. When that person changed because the policy wasn't changed, then the next person couldn't get through. So for higher education policymakers, this means expanding scholarships and maintenance loans, including Sharia complaint options, and recognizing that flexibility is needed in how refugees meet academic and language requirements. And we already heard from Holly and Crane about the challenges people experience. And in terms of immigration policy, I was in a different meeting right before this session. They were talking about intersectionality and they were talking how this immigration policy could also be seen as a fluid part of intersectionality when we talk about refugee education. So restrictions on asylum seekers' ability to work or study can trap people in limbo for many years. So some of the recommendations here we have, they are UK specific, but some of them are relevant to other contexts. They could be done globally. So that's why we have listed them here. So next, I want to talk about call to action that we have it on this slide. To in closing, we just want to highlight that um, one thing we make very clear in this research is that collaboration is key, partnership is key. It is a very complex and wicked problem. It's not that one single sector or country can address this gap. 91% of people don't have access to higher education. And these challenges that we have raised today and we found in our research. In short term, we can act immediately to simplify things like admissions, we increase funding and provide clear guidance. In long term, we can we definitely need a structural change, aligning higher education policies, immigration policies, community support around refugee-led holistic approach. The image you see on the screen, the other images we had, they were created by um, people from refugee background, including myself, in an initiative we had last year, which was initiated by University of East Anglia, part of that initiative of finding home in education. This particular image I took in a front garden of a property I used to live to talk about my research in refugee education. And I use this metaphor of gardener. If we look at refugee education through a lens of a gardener, if we cut the weeds around this cut trunk, and if like we offered like the support that a professional gardener might offer to for the plant to thrive, if there are weeds we cut them, if the soil needs to be changed we do that, then even if it is a cut trunk, that plant will thrive again and will add to the beauty of that garden and can contribute. So that's why I will end with that image and that metaphor here. And as we reflect on these findings, we have a few questions for you that we have on the last slide, but these are a few acknowledgements on that slide that we have just passed. And these are some final thoughts that I will let Corinne and Ollie to facilitate as they are there so that you consider to discuss, but happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Mia and Corinne and Holly. That's really a sort of storming run through lots of big issues and done in a lovely way. So we've got some questions online. We've got questions possibly in the room. Should we start with questions online? Sonia, you were asking a question about the recommendations in their policy briefing. Do you want to come and ask that question? If not, I can pose it for you. So Sonia asked about recommendations 3 and 4. Can you remember which ones they were?
Very much to the in this one.
So I think it was in your actual report she's referring to. Yeah, and I was looking at the report, and one of the questions is about funding, and
Oh, in the policy list?
yes, yeah. So our recommendation 3 is governments and universities should provide greater assistance with maintenance loans, grants, and bursaries. And then 1 4 is about easy, accessible, simple language that can take into account qualifications, speaking English,
Do you think it's that? Or
I think it is, yes, yeah.
So, do you want to do 3 and?
Yeah.
Oh, these ones.
No, these ones.
Yeah.
This is about economic constraints and
Yes.
then about easy guideline.
So just a bit more information on those, is that what she's asking? Yeah.
Or how would you, who should implement them?
Okay. Yeah, I think on one of the things we did try and think about, obviously this relates to the 4th recommendation, is whilst a lot of these require more resources, not all of them need to be reliant on new resources. So for instance, the recommendation 4 about providing guidance that is easier and more accessible for people to understand, that's something that could be done without a huge input of new resources. And that also applies in particular to the greater collaboration between those different groups, because I think often what people were finding is that they were receiving different information They might talk to someone at a college and be told they needed this English qualification, and they might talk to someone at a university and get told they need this. So that that lack of joined up approach to giving information is something that would be hugely helpful and could be addressed without a huge resource input. I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that, Mia, about economic constraints or better information.
I think you beautifully answered the question. Nothing to add from my side. Thank you.
I mean, I don't think it's also impossible to think about more economic resources being available in some areas. Certainly, some universities could approach all those donors that they jealously guard and get money from them. And in some cases, they do. They did that for Ukraine. Refugees will frequently point out to you, non-Ukrainian refugees, they did that for Ukraine. Why are they not doing that for other country refugees who are just criminalized now? So, you know, donors were key in that. There are some very rich universities in the UK and in other countries even richer. So that's something to look at. And also, you know, there's a kind of fluidity around funding within the UK for university funding, such that, you know, there certainly are grants and have been grants, and there's a move to re-grant, re-give grants to students from lower income backgrounds, and refugees frequently fall within that category. So you don't need to be seen to be particularly privileging refugees in some way. I mean, in fact, Bristol does something like this, not grant aid so much, but they give particular educational provision and support to people within the lowest decile of residentially in Bristol, and that would include disproportionately include lots of refugees. So I think there are lots of strategies that are, you know, not resource intensive, that will use resources, but not super resource intensive, that universities could take up.
I was going to ask you, because we were having a conversation about the statutory requirement of university to publish data on care leavers. And actually, I was asking because the recommendation 6 is about better data collection.
Yeah.
And actually, might just jump ahead a bit, Mike Radcliffe came in and similarly asked the question. I don't know whether Mike, you want to come on, which is sort of around that policy lever, whether there will be more policies. Mike, do you want to come in and ask that?
Well, yeah, I suppose it's a. I've just checked. If you site search the Office for Students for the word refugee, it is not mentioned on their website anywhere, which is an artifact in itself. We're all geared up in England to try and tackle equality of opportunity. We have access participation plans. We have all sorts of structures. Refugees don't feature in that, and therefore it's finding the right kind of policy lever in something like our regulator to say you ought to do this. Now, they're not going to necessarily apply that across the sector, but do you get any benefit for this work with the regulator? That would be a key kind of opportunity. And they are the people who set what data we get to collect nationally. So again, you could get individual universities to collect some bits of data, but the data protection requirements are complex. And therefore, if you're trying to collect additional information because you want to, there is that kind of presumption that you've got to have a really good argument, and you're unlikely to get two universities to agree on exactly which bits of data they've collected, and therefore you end up, you know, in problems. So you need the regulator, you need that kind of approach, and therefore it's about trying to put that in their court and say, yeah, we don't want to necessarily put this alongside all the protected characteristics you're currently monitoring, but what about something? And it may be unfair that refugee doesn't spring up on their site, but it is a bit of a kind of surprise that it doesn't anywhere.
I think we've probably all got something to respond to on that. I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, in fact, there is a question on the UCAS form about if you come from a refugee background or not. You don't have to answer it, but universities can use that as an instance of their good practice or not, because, you know, refugees are part of widening participation requirements. So, you know, widening participation officers have to have some fraction of their role applied to refugees. And it is really uneven, I think, because you mentioned OFS, but actually OFS have some actually great policy recommendations for how to, somewhere buried in there, like there are some really good policy recommendations about how to work with refugees in universities. So it's not impossible to imagine something better. Do you want to? Mia, what do you think?
Maybe come in.
I'm just trying to contribute in the chat. Sorry, I was distracted. There are difficult questions there as well. I mean, like the point about we all keep saying universities should collect data on refugee students. Some of the excuses I hear from some universities is like some students, they don't want to carry the label. Sometimes they don't want to be recognized as refugee, or at some points they no longer want to use that label again. But still, it doesn't mean they shouldn't do it. There are people who want to be recognized as a refugee. And then there is that I talked to a student, I do qualitative research. Then someone was saying, I was emphasizing the importance of a stories, qualitative research. Then that student told me, if you're not counted in, you're counted out. And when we don't have these data, then a lot of times then they don't receive the right support because there's no statistics, there's no transparency in data to see how many people are missing the opportunities. And then these concepts that we hear a lot at universities, concepts related to inclusion, belonging, then you see who controls these terms, how do they define them? And these are other layers of the issue.
Great, thank you. That's really interesting and valuable. Abdi, you had your hand up for a while. Apologies. Sorry, I jumped forward. Do you want to come in?
Oh, thank you, David. Yeah, my name is Abdi Rashid. I am a PhD student at the department, second year now, from a refugee background, still carrying the experience. So I think it's really interesting, the talk here, and it actually validates what my journey has been so far. And actually, like the crux of the situation from my own personal journey is the initial support, especially at grassroots level, where the NGOs and those people, for example, doing the heavy lifting, are having the right information to signpost to you to have an entry point at the university, because universities do not come to the communities. Maybe they do, or maybe they don't. But then that linkage as an entry point is really valid, very important. And once at the university, that initial settling stage is really key. And while everyone is struggling, we also have the burden of extra weight of all other packages you have to deal with, in addition to the academic requirement you have to fulfill and tick boxes and fit in and reading and stuff like that. So it's really interesting, and I have experience with charity roles in Northwest here in Greater Manchester, and a lot of the university students who go refugee background, they tend to drop out in second year, mainly in second year and first year, because of the issue of extra support in terms of assignment. Language is an issue, lack of resources at home, internet is taken for granted, maybe laptop is an issue, and things pile up as they go along, and then you don't have anywhere to turn to, and then you either have to you persevere and get through it, or you crack, and then your mind, you have other priorities to sort out. And then, yeah, additional support initially at initial stage and maybe at milestone stages in between transitions. Thank you. It's not a question,
Thank
just a
you.
comment.
Yeah, no, sure. Do you want to respond, Holly?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience. And yeah, I think that raises some really, really important points that came out really strongly in the research, in particular around what you were saying about, I think sometimes for universities, they want the admissions statistics, and it looks great that people from refugee backgrounds have got in, but that really isn't the end of the story, is it? And like you were saying, that continued support is so important. And also from the NGO perspective, I think that is really crucial, because like you were saying, that often is the first point of contact that people have. People aren't going direct to universities with questions. They're often asking the people they have the existing links with, and that is often NGOs. And some of the people working in NGOs that we spoke to said that they really wanted to support people who were keen to access higher education, but they themselves didn't have the information to give people. So I think that goes back to that point around information sharing and cross-sector working. But yeah, thank you for sharing your experience.
Great. To come back to the online questions earlier, Maria, you asked about online degrees. Do you want to follow up on that? Perhaps disappeared already, but so the question.
Yeah, sorry.
Carry on,
It's just sorry, it took forever to unmute and everything. Yes, I'm just seriously just interested about online and whether you asked any specific questions about online degrees. If you did, then whether the responses differed in any way to those.
We didn't ask a specific question about online degrees, but we did ask about online experiences and skills. And as you might expect with any population, there were quite variable approaches to that. But people quite liked learning about digitality as well as learning digitally. That wasn't, the people from refugee backgrounds that we talked to. I think they possibly would take up, some would take up expanded access to higher education through digital means, definitely. But some had tried, because there are universities of this kind, most notably Kiron, that are conducted all online. But actually that however motivated you are, if you're in really difficult circumstances and trying to keep going with the university course online, with no other kind of support, that does prove really, really difficult to do. Only the most motivated, and I think the people with other kinds of capital in their backgrounds are the people who manage to get through that. So that's and people did also talk to us about the university experience and what they wanted from that university experience in their local area. So I think you're right, there's possibilities there, but there's always going to be limits around that. I think Mira probably will know a lot more about that.
Do you want to come in here, or should I go to? Yeah, good.
But yes, as Corinne mentioned, we didn't look at online, but they were talking about digital access or issues related to technology, but we didn't look at online degrees or the programs they offer online.
Okay, good. Kula, you made comments about how we might categorize refugees, and you said it's in relation to the university, your university, and the argument you're trying to make. Do you want to expand on that?
I'm sorry, was the question for me?
Yes, please.
The question about
yes, yes.
The Office for Students?
No, you were saying the argument you're trying to make in your university. Do you want to explain what you're trying to do?
Okay. Yes. So, there is ongoing discussions that, refugees and students from refugee backgrounds are not really within the priority groups when it comes to the regulator. But at the Open University, and I assume in other universities as well, we have the Access and Participation Plan and Widening Participation Plan. And as part of that, we have identified priority groups. So we are in our kind of various meetings with senior colleagues in the university, we are making this argument that, okay, refugee students are not in the priority groups, but they do contribute towards these other categories that we have as priority student groups. And And so that's how we kind of like trying to make the argument that we should be supporting and we should be providing scholarships for refugee students. And it seems to be
That's really
working,
interesting.
at least in my university. So
Okay.
yeah.
Good. That's really great news. And Balaji, you have your hand up. Would you like to come in? Balaji, do you want to, yes, okay. If you can unmute, that'd be brilliant. It seems like there we go. Now you should be able to do it. Sorry, I don't know what's happened there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Miri, for the presentation, and it was really useful for me. I will first start by introducing myself. I'm Adebolaji, and I'm a third-year PhD student in the University of Glasgow, Scotland, and I'm also a refugee myself. So everything that's been said here today has really been useful, and it actually resonates with my particular journey. But the most important aspect for me that I want to bring out, and I want to kind of say that is a good thing for me to see that we are trying to at least adopt a refugee-centered approach, which actually is going to focus on each kind of refugee and how best to support them. Because in the system, I discover one of the problems we've got is that even the educators, the professors, the doctors, they don't really know what the experiences of this group of people are. I think they just work with theory and maybe what they just know online, but they don't really know what we go through or how we try to assess our education. So sometimes you are being lumped up with every other student that is from maybe a disadvantaged background, and also researching about higher education access, retention, and completion for refugees and those seeking asylum. And on my journey, I've really discovered that even the widening access participation team is made to be like they are really supportive. But in the midst of it, like Mr. Miri earlier said, there is no data on refugee because I've collected that on my own research. And I've asked all the widening access participation, do you have a data of how many refugees that you have accepted to your university? And none of them is able to say there is a specific data for refugees. It's just data for a collective group of underrepresented people, which is not good enough. And that's why I'm really linking what I have to say to the refugee-centered approach, because it is only when you deal with this group of people, that is when you can actually specifically get their issues, their problems, and then you can now get the best way to resolve it. I've got someone who has done a undergrad and is not eligible for student loan and went for scholarship that is meant for refugee in one of our universities in Scotland. And it was a partial scholarship, which left the student stranded. And eventually the student had to drop out from that postgraduate degree. And when this comes up, other people feel that a refugee has got access to public funds, so they can do everything that every other student can do, but it wasn't so. So I really want to thank you all for bringing this up today and for even giving me more insights into my research. But I just want to say that it will be a good thing for us to take up from the academia, from even the local councils and even the supporting organizations to ensure that refugees are a specific group of underrepresented group with specific and different kind of issues that could affect them while they are assessing higher education or while they are trying to complete. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for sharing, Georgie. That's really frank, honest, and helpful. I mean, you know, anyone wants to respond, but I wonder whether we might want to broaden it slightly to think about how does the UK do compared to other countries? I know you've been doing some work in Barcelona, Holly. Could you comment on Spanish universities and their ability to address these issues?
So I wasn't specifically looking at higher education in Spain, but I do know that a lot of the issues that people face in terms of, in particular, having their previous qualifications recognised is something that is quite prevalent. I don't know if you know about other like Hungary and stuff, but it is quite prevalent in other European countries, coming up against similar issues of previous qualifications being disregarded depending on what country they're from, or the attempts to have the equivalence, work out what the equivalent is, being very long, very complicated, and sometimes costly. So I know that is a kind of something that's faced quite broadly. In terms of actual access figures, I don't know those. I don't know, Corin or Mary, if you've got any like kind of data on that, but I don't know that, unfortunately.
Great.
No.
Mary, did you come in on that?
I just heard recently that most of the data UNHCR has about those who have access to higher education is mostly from Global North. So that is another issue we need to take into account. We might have a lot of initiatives which are not counted, or we may not have. And most of the support is at like in countries in Global North, not in Global South, that they have more refugees there.
I think it's worth thinking about the difficulties of this situation for countries that do have large numbers of refugees, you know, and who actually usually have a legal right to access higher education in those countries, but then there will be other barriers, for instance, around residency, that they may not have proper residency, for instance, in Lebanon, and I think Jordan, that's the case. And then so many refugees in countries with high numbers of refugees are consigned to very high cost private universities, and so only an elite few can really access higher education in those situations. So that's problematic. You know, there are many schemes UNHCR itself runs, and it's collaborative with in camps. And again, that generally takes out a very tiny sector of refugees within camps into higher education. And I would say in the worst case, then siphon them off to other universities in the global north, you know, to Canadian universities often. But there have been very good schemes. You know, for instance, there's a scheme related to the Dadaab camp that is also done, brings people from refugee backgrounds and local people who have lower higher education access together to do degree level professional training, and that's connected with Kenyatta University. It's borderless higher education for refugees. It's been going for about 15 years, I think. So there are great examples of good practice you have to look for, but they're not scaled and rolled out really. And maybe that's part of the issues, and people often say that in this area, that, you know, universities and countries, you know, are going to have to operate these things according to their own conjunctures and contexts. So it's quite hard to generalize about it.
Great. So something in the past we have actually heard someone from Kenyatta talking about that. On call, maybe more as well. This has been so interesting, and it's been great to sort of expand out from face broader question. And we haven't particularly talked about the initiative qualifications passport, but I think that is another initiative as well, new but hard to make work. It's hard to scale. But it's interesting to see how that fits in with this UNESCO's broader push around the global education convention. Thank you all for coming today. We will post these slides on our website tomorrow and recording. Mia, thank you very much for joining us online. Sorry you couldn't be with us in person, but a final thank you also to Holly and Corinne. You've helped us really think through some big issues here, and thanks for the conversation, some comments online. Perhaps if one thing comes out of all this, we can get the data collection more visible and especially on that policy, that would be really, really important. Brilliant. Thank you all for joining us, and join us again next Tuesday.